Hello, Professor. My name is Richard Forbes. I am a student in your online Law of Mass Communications course in the summer of 2020. Today I will be speaking about the American public's right and abilities when conducting a public protest. I will be unpacking the legal protections of both protesters and police and the further implications of conflicting and controversial news regarding the current events of the Black Lives Matter movement, though this information may also draw from other recent movements. Protests are seemingly an essential part of American lifestyle. As a way of attention grabbing, protests bring conversations about critical issues, events, and injustices to the forefront of American media. Ranging from powerful acts of civil disobedience, the history of protests can be found in every decade with a new focus on political and social controversies. Of course, the history books tell us of iconic stories such as the American Revolution, Occupy Wall Street, and the fight for women's suffrage. However, the latest protest, Black Lives Matter, has taken the nation, rather the world, by storm. With marches across the globe, the Black Lives Matter movement has secured itself as a notable piece of history. However, the controversy of the United States' social condition remains. With a complicated mixture of social distancing due to the coronavirus pandemic and mass protests in city streets, movement supporters and opposers are at odds. One popular and conflicting topic is the right of protesters against police brutality and political defamation. By learning about our right to protest and historical events, we gain insight into how the freedoms of speech and assembly continue to challenge and mold American life. According to the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution in the National Archives, the civil rights and liberties of the freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, and petition are covered under this First Amendment. It, quote unquote, sets the rules and regulations for due process and reserves all powers not delegated to the federal government to the people or states. In this case, the most important and relevant information pertains to the people's rights to protest, practice press, and assemble freely. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution protects the many variants of protests by protecting the ability to conduct peaceful public assemblies and free speech. These rights are wide-encompassing, including several controversial actions like flag burning and sit-ins. In the United States, protesting individuals can freely gather in public spaces like sidewalks and parks, though some cities require permits or limit the size of the gathering. For example, the Los Angeles Police Department released documents at the start of the Black Lives Matter movement in March to cooperate with protest organizers. One flyer contained detailed information on the protection of protesters. However, the city requires a permit to formally recognize the protest as an event. The city outlines a march route and limits the sound decibels of shouting people. So, while the U.S. Constitution protects the people's civil liberties and cities, cities and counties have the power to control such freedoms. Now that we've analyzed the abilities for peaceful protests, what about violent ones? In a Harvard article, a political scientist examined the bridge between violence and political action and found a positive correlation. This can be seen in history after the civil rights movement lasted more than 20 years and resulted in thousands of clashes between protesters and law enforcement. Catalyzed by the death of George Floyd via the police, one of the nearly 1,000 disproportionately killed black Americans, some Black Lives Matter protests have erupted violently. Whether instituted by law enforcement or protesters, the resulting violence only escalates and exemplifies the purpose of these protests. In a violent protest, a protester's rights still stand. As videos of law enforcement officers who violate citizen rights emerge, citizens are reminded of the appropriate conduct of both officers and people. Riot police refers to the measures taken by law enforcement officers to disperse and arrest crowds involved in public demonstrations, including protests. Riot personnel are often equipped with non-lethal, though painful, weapons such as tear gas, rubber bullets, and tasers. In the latest Black Lives Matter movement, videos have shown officers using these tools to scatter crowds and corral protesters for mass arrests. Though the U.S. Constitution does protect a protester's right to assemble and speak out, law enforcement has the ability to forcefully pressure groups using non-lethal methods. As protests continue, opinions continue to clash in political preferences, with President Trump and other Republican leaders calling for protests to end and the forceful arrest of protesters. The legal implications of these threats are complicated, as protesters do not pose an imminent health threat to the surrounding area. It has been questioned whether large group gatherings, such as protests, can be dispersed due to the current coronavirus pandemic. Some cities still have social distancing requirements, so the laws will vary by location. If locations that do not require social distancing, people can still gather as protected by the First Amendment. There is no doubt that the Black Lives Matter protests have caused political turmoil. No matter what political party you belong to, the general agreement is that this is a human rights issue that should be rectified. As a member of Generation Z, this is the first historical event I have had the opportunity to participate in. For those protesting, it is important to remember your rights and understand the abilities of law enforcement in a crisis situation, like a riot. Using both current events and the laws at hand, protesters can be prepared to fight for policies they believe in, while maintaining a safe and legal well-being.